Graham Lindsay asks, how can we recognize our own implicit bias? Graham, this is a great question. I prefer to ask it a slightly different way. I put this on Quora a long time ago. Here's Morgan. I put this on Quora a long time ago. Do you believe that some of your beliefs may be false? I think it's an essential fact that we conflate truth and belief. Some people have objected to this. A lot of people give a view that says, oh, look, beliefs are not necessarily true, therefore what is true cannot be conflated with belief. But that's a funny thing to say, because really what we're saying is, I don't believe that beliefs equate to truth. We have no way of assessing truth except by our beliefs. We must conflate them if we're being honest about the way that we think ourselves. So I think that this question, how do we identify our own implicit biases, is ironic in the sense that it proves in its existence that we can't. We cannot assess our own biases. In doing so, we would be applying them. So really, in order to have any concept of our own biases, we need to do something which is both paradoxical and ironic. And this is why I talk about this sort of thing so much, because it's the key to rational thought, in a sense. It's understanding the irrationality of what we do. I've got to give a shout out here to a friend of mine, Matt Acutt, who's written some really wonderful stuff. He's one of the architects of the datalogical metaphysical theory, which I'll link below here. Matt's a very good philosopher, and he gives an excellent example of having a theory of everything, a really good, quite coherent theory of everything, which instead of, like some other philosophers, explaining to the world that this is the nature of the world and believe it or else because this is how things are. Matt's method of achieving this is by asking people like me, for criticism, for objections, for problems, trying to destroy the theory. And of course, this is how science works. But how do we do that in a way that is unbiased? How do we criticize ourselves in a manner which frees us from the biases that we're trying to identify? It can only be done using ironic paradoxes, very funny things which I've written about in a recent article, and which I suggest, if they exist, then they don't, and if they don't exist, then they do. And here's why. When we consider how we assess our own image, at what we look like, how we work, we have to use something like a mirror. So for me to know what my face looks like, I need something which reflects that. But of course, I'm subjecting that image to my own interpretation. So am I really seeing myself, or am I just seeing the biases that I apply to the empirical evidence that is before me? Well, really, it's got to be the latter. So in order for something like that, a mirror, to reveal truth in some way, it would need to show the alternative to what you think. You would need to show how you are wrong in your perception of your own image. So that would be a paradox, wouldn't it? Because the way that I determine whether an image is true is by comparing it to my own action. I believe I'm moving my hands in these ways. I'm seeing that the camera I'm using to make this video is showing what appears to be a similar, but of course inverted, image. So I decide that that must be a true image because it correlates with my beliefs regarding what I am doing in the real world. But in order for my biases to be offset by that image, it would need to be criticizing that belief. It would need to be showing the alternative to that belief. So not only would that be paradoxical in that the image that is being mirrored to me would not be the same as I expect, it would be ironic for exactly that reason. It would be showing the alternative interpretations of what I believe, which would be what I do not believe. So in overcoming our biases, we need to do something which we effectively cannot do, which is believe what we don't believe, because we don't believe it, and that in itself becomes evidence of the removal of the bias that we apply that usually verifies what we consider to be valid and true. Let's do that again really quickly. If I see what I expect, I am not perceiving my biases because my biases produce the expectation. If I see something which contradicts what I expect in a manner which also reflects it, then that must be bypassing, overcoming, removing my biases from that perception. But in that case, I would be perceiving something I do not regard as true. Isn't that strange? But it must be the case, because all other possibilities involve biases reinforcing themselves. And this is what I've said in a recent article explaining why cognitive biases have an evolutionary basis to them, because that's how evolution works. As Matt explains in his theory in one of his articles about his theory really nicely, we have to assume that the assumptions that we make are true at some point. If we don't, please Morgan, if we don't, then we can't get anywhere because we effectively have no flaw. That's what I do philosophically a lot of the time. I try and take the flaw from questions. I try and remove the assumptions that we make in order to build our sandcastles, because I think that's a very essential requirement for answering this sort of question. How do I know if I'm wrong? How would I know? I would only know by someone or something else showing me something which I disagree with, and me accepting that that may actually refute what I believe effectively. But the only type of refutation that could be acceptable in logical terms would be something that is effectively perpendicular, something which is a match with respect to the type of data being assessed, but which reflects it in a manner that is out of phase. Now, if we think about this physically, a very, very interesting thing happens. When you consider wave interactions, when things are out of phase, but exactly replicant, you actually have destructive interference. What you see is nothing. You have this elimination of what was being observed. And this is something which is really quite profound and very crucial to me, which is that when we see something which overcomes our biases and we begin to accept that, then what we actually begin to perceive is nonsense or nothing, or an entity which is undecidable and indescribable, because our biases are what allow us to do that. Lastly, just want to talk, pardon the sweat, it's very hot in Australia today. The last thing I just want to talk about as an example of all of this is the nature of vision. I love talking about vision. I love talking about especially perception as part of visual physiology, and the fact that physiology cannot explain perception. There has long been sort of theories regarding the existence of tetrachromats in humans, so humans that have 4 types of cones that would allow them to perceive an extended color spectrum. It's sort of the opposite of color blindness in a sense, and the argument works both ways. If someone were colorblind, how could a color-sighted person prove that to them, except by that colorblind person accepting on faith that things like the Ishihara tests are real. There are these wonderful fakes on the internet of what look like Ishihara dot tests. And they said, if you can't see the number here, then you're red-green colorblind. And the dots are red and green, there's no visible number. Believe me, I know how these tests work. and it's a really deep point on the nature of perception. You can't prove what is being perceived and whether that is true or not. You just can't do it. So similarly, whether we consider people to be colorblind or whether we can consider these tetrachromats and women who may actually have an extended color spectrum visible to them because of the nature of X inactivation, an interesting genetic phenomenon that occurs in cells. If we think about that, there is no way that someone who does not have the same type of vision as those groups of people could perceive the way that they see the world. We could use various words to try and approximate it, but there's no way that we could overcome the bias that I am a trichromat, I think. There's no way to do it, because vision as an objective concept, as something that could actually be held up as a standard and said, this is what you should see, and this is what everyone else sees, you actually cannot do that in anything except abstract terms, which we all agree must be the case for the sake of functionality. So whether you have 20/20 vision or whether you're long-sighted like me, all of these ideas of the variation of human experience, of which I think color vision is a really pretty example, show that we cannot overcome our biases because our biases explain the world to us. They are the way that we actually determine what makes sense, and whatever challenges those will be nonsense.